All right, so now that we have an understanding as to what intrusion detection systems are, what snort is, how it works, the different types of rules, and the rule syntax, we can actually get started with the practical demonstration. So we are going to be switching over to the Ubuntu 20.04 VM, and I'll be showing you how to get snort installed, and then we'll go through the setup and configuration process, and then we'll run a couple of tests, talk about writing our own rules, and we'll also be taking a look at the community rules. So let me just switch over to my Kali Linux, or my Ubuntu virtual machine. All right, so I'm back on my Ubuntu virtual machine. This is the same virtual machine we had used in the previous video for network traffic analysis with Wireshark. And I'm currently on the Snort website, which is available or accessible on snort.org. And I also have another website here that essentially hosts a tool called Snorpy that allows you to easily generate your own rules for snort, which is absolutely fantastic. And I'll be covering how to use it in a couple of seconds. All right, so on the Snort webpage, where we are going to be utilizing we're going to be installing snort through the snort package, the snort 2 package available within the Ubuntu repositories. So I recommend following along with Ubuntu. It doesn't matter what version of Ubuntu, the snort 2 package is available within the repositories and can be installed with the aptitude package manager. So all you need to do to get snort 2 installed rather, is to open up your terminal. And I'm just going to zoom in so you can actually see what's going on. And I'm going to say sudo apt get update, and make sure to update your repositories. I've already done that. I'm going to say sudo apt get install snort, and I'm going to hit yes to just accept the installation there, and it's going to begin the installation process. Now this is very important, right? And let me make sure you can see that. I'm just going to go into my terminal, and I'll make sure that you can actually see the text displayed here. So when you're installing snort 2, it's going to tell you that you need to configure snort, right? So you can see that it tells you to specify the interface that snort will be listening on, right? So as you can see here, it's essentially telling you to specify the interface that snort should listen on. And ideally, if you've set up your virtual environment correctly, then if you type in ifconfig on the Ubuntu virtual machine, this is going to be your primary interface, right? So this is the IP on the subnet. You can see that the snort virtual machine is going to be on 192.168.2.179. So we need to specify this interface. In your case, it may be Ethernet 0, Ethernet 1. All you need to do is just take note of that. In my case, it's ENP-S03. Let me make sure I've got that correctly. So that is ENP0S3. So again, make sure you type that in correctly. So ENP0S3, hit enter. It's now going to ask you for the actual address range for the network, right? So this is where you specify the actual network range. In my case, or in the case of a VirtualBox, if you are using it, in my case, it's 192.168.2.0/24 because there are 256 addresses, as it explains here with the CYBERTALK annotation. So, make sure that you're specifying the correct CYBERTALK, the correct range for your network, right? So in my case, that is the actual address range for my local network. You can identify this information if you're a little bit confused by opening up your terminal, or another terminal for that matter, and typing in IPAS. And if you take a look at the interface here, your main interface, you can see that under INET, it'll actually tell you the actual network range. So just make sure you replace the actual IP here to 0, and because we're essentially specifying the entire range of devices or IPs. Once that is done, just hit OK. It's then going to complete installing snort. So we'll give that a couple of seconds. It's going to again ask you to essentially specify the interface or the interfaces which snort should listen on. Now, if you are using snort as an intrusion detection and intrusion prevention system, then this is where you typically specify both interfaces, right? So if you're setting up snort on a bare metal server, then you need to have two network interface cards, whereby the first network interface card is where the traffic comes in from the router, and the other one is essentially connected to the switch, or based on the diagram that I highlighted, is essentially what goes into the switch, and that supplies the traffic to the actual network or all the devices that are part of that network through the switch. And in order for that to work, you need to enable or set up port, or you need to be able to forward traffic from one network interface to another. Now, this is beyond the scope of what we'll be covering, because we really don't need to do that. So again, I'll just hit enter here. And we'll give this a couple of seconds to complete. There we are, it should be done. And there we go. So we can confirm that Snort is installed by saying Snort version. And you can see Snort version 2.9.7.0 build 149 is installed. Fantastic. And it has all the dependencies installed. So libpcap for capturing traffic. And of course, this is what Wireshark uses to essentially interact with the actual PCAP API. So now that that is done, we need to configure one more option, and that is to essentially enable promiscuous mode on our current interface. And again, the reason I'm saying this is even with VirtualBox, if I just open up my VM settings here, one thing that you want to do is open up your settings for this particular virtual machine, head over into network, and make sure that promiscuous mode is set to allow, under advanced, make sure it's set to allow all. Now, if you're not running this as a virtual machine, then what you'd need to do is say sudo IP link set, and then you specify the name of your interface. So enp0s3 promisc on. Hit enter, and that'll essentially enable promiscuous mode. All right, now, if you want to take a look at the actual man pages for Snort, you can do that as well. I'll be explaining the most important commands, but this is a really fantastic resource. If you're ever confused as to what's going on, then the first place I recommend you check is the actual man pages. So, you have your standard options here, and I'll be explaining them as we move along. So you can go through that. Now, let's talk about configuring Snort. Now, the default configuration file for Snort is stored under the etc directory, of course. So if we open up we display the contents of the etc Snort directory, this is pretty much where you'll be making all your changes, right? So you can see that you have a rules directory. That's where the rules are saved. Now, by default, the Ubuntu Snort 2 package comes pre-packaged with quite a few community rules and a few rules developed by Snort themselves. I'll get into that in a second. And then you have the main configuration file that is called snort.conf. This is arguably the most important file that you will be using to configure Snort, and it's really the core of Snort functionality. So what I recommend you do if you're a beginner is make a copy of that file, because if you're a beginner, you are likely to make mistakes. I'll be explaining the format and the structure of the configuration file in regards to what is most important to us. All right. In my case, I know what I'm doing. So, I can essentially just modify it and use that as my own. Now, one of the great features of Snort is that it essentially allows you to make a copy of this configuration file with another name. So it could be snort test.conf, and you can essentially run Snort with that configuration file as opposed to the default one. However, as I said, in my case, I don't really need to do that. Also, take note of the actual permissions required to make changes to this file. I'm currently using an unprivileged user called Alexis, who is part of the sudo group, which means I can directly, run vim or any other text editor to modify it. So I'll say sudo vim etc snort, and we can open up snort.conf, right? So I'm going to say snort.conf, and my bad. I'm just going to open that up again. So snort.conf, there we go. All right, so this is the Snort configuration file. Now, one area that you should take note of is this index of sections within the configuration file. All right, so section 1 essentially covers the process of setting the network variables. You can then configure the decoder, the base detection engine, the preprocessors, the output plugins, your rule set, and the other community rule sets, etc. Now, the most important options are going to be under step 1, where you set the network variables. So you want to scroll to the IP variable homenet variable, right? So for homenet, what we want to do, this is essentially where we specify the actual subnet or the actual network that we want to monitor, right? Or that Snort is going to monitor. So in my case, I already know that because I had specified it. That is going to be 192.168.2.0/24. Now, the external network addresses, as it says here, leave as any in most situations. So this, as I said, I would recommend leaving it as any, because ideally you do not want to confine this variable, the external network variable, to a specific subnet, because attacks and intrusions can come from any network or any IP address or any subnet, if you will. All right, so that's the first option. Now, one of the great features of the Snort configuration file is it allows you to list, specific hosts that might be part of the critical infrastructure of a network. So it allows you to specify the actual list of DNS servers on your network. So you can replace the homenet variable with the IP address of a DNS server on your network, an SMTP server, a web server, so on and so forth. For now, I would not recommend playing around with that. You can also modify the list of ports where you can run web servers on. So this will tie into the actual intrusion detection process. As I said, I recommend leaving this as is for now. What we want to do is we want to take a look at the path to our rules file. So just below the actual network configuration, we have the rules section here, right? So this allows us to specify firstly the rule path, and by default the rule path, the rule path variable essentially points towards etc snort rules, which is perfectly fine. All right, so we just take note of that directory. So that means that this configuration file will essentially pull in rules or load in rules within that rule path directory. So leave that as is. What we want to do now is we want to head to the bottom of this file. So you can use the page down key, and we want to head over to the rules section. All right, which should be, there we are. Here it is. Right, so this is step 7, customize your rule set. Okay, so again, site-specific rules. This is, in this particular case, we're essentially saying the rule path. This is where you can essentially specify the actual rules file that contains the rules that you'd like to use, right? And by default, your predefined rules that you will be creating yourself are going to be stored or can be written in a file called local.rules, and that file is stored under etc snort rules, and the name is local.rules. So this file is already created. Again, remember, this file is for the rules that you will create yourself. So it currently is empty. And then the include files commented below have been disabled, and in some cases we have a few that are enabled. So to disable a rule file, just comment it with the hash or the pound symbol. So they've been disabled because they're not available in the stock Debian rules. So if it is disabled and it is commented, then that means that it's not available within the etc snort rules directory. If it is enabled, then that means that these rules are already existing. And as I said, most of these have been developed by Snort and the community. So that means that these are available and are active. So what does this all mean? It means that when you run Snort, there are essentially going to be two segments of rules or two categories of rules that will be loaded. You have your local rules, which will contain your own predefined rules. And then if you have any other custom ones, then they can be specified right over here, right? And they'll all be loaded. So I really like this organizational structure because it allows you to separate between, community rules or rules developed by Snort and your own rules. So you have two files you have one file for your own rules and then a list of other rule files for community or for community rules or rules developed by Snort. So you can see you have DDoS rules, DNS rules, DOS rules, exploit rules, and these default ones are really, really helpful. And then of course you should have the community or a few community ones here. There we are. So we have a few community SQL injection rules, web DOS rules, etc., etc. So we pretty much at this point do not need to do anything. However, for me to explain how things work, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write the changes that I made so far. What I need to do firstly is we need to test and see whether the changes we've made to the configuration file are valid and if there are any syntax errors at all. So I'm going to write and quit, and we'll get back to that file. Now, in order to test a configuration file with snort, we need to run snort. So snort requires root privileges because we're capturing traffic. So we'll say sudo, and we will say snort, and we'll use the T option. And again, if you want to learn what that option does, I'll just open this up here and I'll search for that specific occurrence. So this is in this will start up snort in self-test mode, and we'll check all supplied command line switches and rules. So in this case, we're testing the configuration file. So I'll say sudo, and I will say snort T, and then you specify your interface. Now, this is very important. So if you're running this or you're following along here, then you just specify the interface that you're going to be monitoring, or that snort is going to be monitoring. In our case, it is, or in my case, it's ENP 3SO or 3S0, and then you specify the configuration file. So etc snort and snort.conf, and it's going to run a check on it. Sorry, that we need to specify the C option. So that specifies the configuration file. There we are. And it's going to generate quite a lot of output. So, given the fact that we have a few community rules here, it's going to give you a few errors telling you that they could be duplicates. Don't worry about that. As I said, we'll actually get into disabling that in a second. The most important piece of diagnostic information is going to be this this set of lines here. So it's going to tell you how many snort rules have been read or imported, and you can see we have 3,476 detection rules. All right, so 3,476 option chains linked into 290 chain headers. So it'll then sort the actual rules based on the type of ports or the protocol. So TCP, UDP, ICMP, and IP, and the actual type of connection. So whether it's it's coming from any address, etc., etc. Right now, in order to learn how to use snort, I would recommend disabling those the actual rules developed by snort and the community. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go back into the configuration file, and we are going to comment all of these rules, all of these custom rules. So let me just modify my Vim correction for the root user so that we can actually see the line numbers. So set number syntax on, so that when we open it up again, we now have line numbering. So I'm just going to scroll to where those custom rules are specified, and we're just going to comment all of them. So in order to do this, we know that the rules start, remember, we want to leave the local rules specification on. We want to get rid of all of these ones here. So the line starts at 578, and I know that it ends at 669, no, not 69, 696. There we are. So to add a comment in front of all of these rules to disable them, what we're going to do is I'm just going to use the colon functionality within Vim, and I'm then going to say from line 578, 696, what we want to do is we want to, at the beginning of each line, so let me just say the beginning of each line, we want to add the pound or hash symbol. I'll hit enter, and as you can see, it does it. One of the great reasons to use Vim. So you can see it only does it for the lines that we specified. So now the only rules that will be loaded are going to be within the local.rules file. So I'm going to write and quit, and if we run the actual self-test again, you can now see that we don't get any of those errors that we got in regards to having duplicated SIDs or signature IDs. So 0 snort rules read, 0 detection rules, 0 decoder rules, etc. I just want to take a couple of moments to thank our Patreons. Thank you Michael Hubbard, Dustin Umpress, Jerry Speds, Doozy, Sid Saab, Ryan Carr, Shamir Douglas, Jojo Bibi, Palangos, Kush Kev, RS, Nino Buikov, and David Bricker. You guys are really awesome. Thank you very much for supporting us, and you guys make these types of videos possible. So we really appreciate it, and we look forward to producing even more high quality content.